We all know box office success doesn't equal movie quality. Great films like The Shawshank Redemption, Blade Runner, and It's a Wonderful Life famously bombed at first, only to become classics later. Budgets are higher, expectations crazier. Studios aren't looking just for hits anymore. They're chasing billion-dollar jackpots. So when a movie tanks these days, it doesn't just quietly disappear. It crashes hard. Let's look at a few that didn't just flop. They cost obscene money to make and became legendary disasters. How much money does it take to kill an entire cinematic universe? Turns out about $195 million, thanks to Tom Cruise's version of The Mummy. And remember, this wasn't even Universal's first try. They already spent another $100 million on Dracula Untold, which was quietly swept under the rug after it failed. Universal thought they had a guaranteed hit. They were so confident, they didn't just stop at Cruise. They lined up Johnny Depp, Javier Bardem, Russell Crowe, Angelina Jolie, this huge roster of big names for their new dark universe before The Mummy even came out. The film managed to save itself from total embarrassment with decent numbers in China, hitting around $400 million worldwide. But it was still such a huge financial loss that Universal immediately canceled the whole Dark Universe project. The next time they tried rebooting a classic monster, with the 2020 version of The Invisible Man, they spent about 4% of what The Mummy cost and ended up making money. Here's a movie almost nobody remembers. The Call of the Wild came out in 2020, barely made any noise, and faded fast. Which makes sense. This is a slow-paced adventure story based on a 100-year-old novel, featuring Harrison Ford hanging out with a CGI dog. Somehow, somebody thought this needed a gigantic $150 million budget. And speaking of CGI, that dog buck is pretty weird looking. You spend the whole film just staring at Harrison Ford trying to act gruff and emotional opposite an obvious digital creation. The whole thing just feels off. The studio ended up losing somewhere between 50 and $100 million on it. Honestly, the only interesting thing anyone remembers is a fan theory floating around online that the movie secretly explains the origin of Han Solo and Chewbacca. Seriously, look it up sometime. When Bruce Almighty made almost $500 million, a sequel was inevitable, even though Jim Carrey immediately passed on coming back. But instead of making a small, safe sequel, Universal decided to spend $175 million, literally Fast and Furious level money, on a follow-up comedy starring Steve Carell as Noah building an ark, without Jim Carrey. This was just a bizarre move. Comedies shouldn't cost almost $200 million, especially sequels missing their biggest selling point. Universal threw money at special effects instead of jokes, and it shows. Nobody laughed. Nobody cared. It bombed hard. If you're ever tempted to make a Jim Carrey sequel without Jim Carrey, this is your cautionary tale. The Terminator franchise is like a zombie at this point. In the last decade alone, studios spent over $500 million trying and failing to reboot it 3 separate times. And every single time was basically the same story. In 2009, Terminator Salvation tried giving us the future war we'd always wanted. Cost $200 million, was supposed to launch a whole trilogy. It didn't. Bad reviews, rights issues, and poor box office killed it immediately. 2015's Terminator Genisys tried nostalgia, new timelines, Arnold back again. Spent another $155 million. Same exact result, critical disaster, box office flop, trilogy cancelled. Then came 2019's Dark Fate. James Cameron and Linda Hamilton returned. Fans got excited. Studio spent another $185 million. And you guessed it. Bad reviews, lost money, trilogy cancelled again. So that's 3 reboots, 3 failed trilogies, and over $540 million spent with nothing to show for it. After that much money and 3 flops in a row, maybe now they'll finally let the Terminator rest in peace. Okay, remember when Hollywood was desperate to kick off franchises based on literally anything? Well, King Arthur, Legend of the Sword was exactly that. Someone actually thought we all wanted a Knights of the Round Table cinematic universe. I'm not kidding, 6 movies planned from the start. And of course, to no one's surprise, we got exactly 1. Honestly, you could tell this was doomed from the minute it was announced. Nobody really knew what it was supposed to be. Part historical action, part mythical hero origin, part fantasy movie with witches and monsters. It just bounced between all those things, totally confused about what it wanted to be. Guy Ritchie directed, and he can be hit or miss when handling huge studio budgets. This was definitely one of his misses. The movie didn't even come close to making back its enormous $175 million budget. But hey, at least Ritchie bounced back later with Aladdin. Here's another $175 million mistake. 47 Ronin. The original story of the 47 Ronin is a classic Japanese legend, something you'd think Hollywood wouldn't mess up. But then someone decided Keanu Reeves should be the star, which was weird enough, and then threw in a bunch of random CGI monsters that looked like they were made on a PlayStation 2. The director, Carl Rinsch, was totally new to big-budget filmmaking, and it showed. $175 million was way too much, way too fast for him. Plus, the studio interfered constantly. He couldn't handle it and got completely overwhelmed. They finally fired him during post-production, ordered massive reshoots, and tried desperately to fix the mess he'd made. Of course, by that point, everyone already knew it was gonna flop, and flop it did. Didn't even hit $150 million worldwide. Critics shredded it, and poor Carl Rinsch's career never recovered. Haven't heard much from him since. Robert Downey Jr.'s first big role after Marvel, after becoming literally the biggest movie star on Earth, was Dolittle. Yeah, the doctor who talks to animals. His first non-Tony Stark role in 6 years, and maybe the biggest misfire of his entire career. Funny enough, the original Dr. Dolittle from 1967 bombed horribly too, so this movie at least kept that tradition alive. Audiences hated it in test screenings, so the studio panicked and spent a fortune on 3 weeks of reshoots, bringing the budget up to a ridiculous $175 million. Their big fix, adding more comedy to make it funnier and broaden its appeal. And how exactly did they make it funnier? Well, they added the infamous dragon scene. You know, the one where Dolittle literally gives a dragon a colonoscopy. He pulls out bones and bagpipes from inside the dragon's butt, using a leek. And that leak was handed to him by a talking duck with a wooden leg, voiced by Octavia Spencer. Yes, someone really approved that idea. And then everyone acted shocked when the movie failed spectacularly. Gemini Man cost about $138 million, which honestly isn't huge for a big Hollywood blockbuster these days. But watching this movie, you can definitely see where all that money went, and where it didn't go. Ang Lee, the director, was obsessed with making a fully CGI young Will Smith. They spent a ton of money trying to digitally recreate Smith from his Fresh Prince days. Except the CGI Smith never looks right. Always a little off, kinda creepy, totally stuck in the uncanny valley. Honestly, why not just shave off his goatee and call it a day? Will Smith has barely aged anyway. Then Lee decided to shoot the whole thing at 120 frames per second, an expensive gimmick nobody cared about. Instead of focusing on the actual script or the story, he just got totally distracted playing around with fancy new tech. Audiences shrugged, nobody showed up, and Gemini Man ended up as one of 2019's biggest flops. Someone at Disney thought it was a good idea to spend $250 million. Yes, $250 million on a Western. Clearly, Disney hoped this would turn into the next Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. They hired the same director, Gore Verbinski, threw in Johnny Depp doing another weird character, and hoped for the best. Obviously, it didn't work. Let me put that $250 million in perspective for you. You could literally make Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven 10 times for the same money, and still have enough cash left over to fund Django Unchained. Crazy, right? The Lone Ranger couldn't even manage to make a dent. Didn't revive Westerns, didn't make back its budget, didn't do anything. Just vanished into Hollywood's giant pile of incredibly expensive mistakes.